So yeah, I'm in Australia. Long story. Never been here before. Here to do my Tom Lehrer show at the Sydney Fringe. Hope it all goes well. But I thought, in honour of being in Australia, I'm going to do one of my top 5 videos about one of my favourite things that Australia has given the world. And so here are, in no particular order, my 5 favourite Ozploitation movies. Now, Ozploitation was a term coined by film nerds and critics alike to describe a genre of movie which arose in Australia in the 70s and developed through the 80s. Generally speaking, low budget, usually quite violent, horror-tinged action or action-tinged horror. Obviously kind of inspired by the Roger Corman school in the States, and really drenched in that kind of exuberant grimness that only really Australians can do. So we'll start with probably the most famous example of this, Mad Max. And yes, I do mean Mad Max, as in the original Mad Max. As I pointed out in a previous video, one of the reasons that Mad Max 2 was retitled The Road Warrior in the States was because that flashback sequence at the beginning kind of renders Mad Max a bit redundant, and you can just start with that movie. And the Mad Max verse, as we tend to think of it, which we're still getting new installments of. Recently we had Furiosa, the gasoline wars in the irradiated wasteland. That doesn't really kick in until the second Mad Max movie. The world ends at some point between the first 2 Mad Max movies, because the first Mad Max movie, the world is still very much there, if kind of going to shit in a very Australian sort of way. The first Mad Max movie is really just a slightly futuristic, rather comic bookish cops versus bikers movie. But one of the things which makes it classic Ozploitation is the amount of bang it gets for its obviously fairly meager buck. George Miller in particular kind of invented a whole new way of filming car chases to make them more like medieval jousts. And for better or worse, it gave the world Mel Gibson. And spawned an entire franchise and, let's face it, genre, which is still going to this day. Before we move on, quick trivia question. What does Mad Max specifically have in common with Maverick? And I don't mean that they were both played by Mel Gibson, if you include the 90s movie. I mean Maverick as in Tom Cruise. Answers at the end. Okay, next up we have Razorback. Razorback's an absolute corker. Again, could only be made in Australia, could only be made by Australians. And the Australian it was made by was Russell Mulcahy, who then, of course, went on to give the world Highlander, and unfortunately also Highlander 2. But Razorback's wonderful. When it was released, it was kind of pitched as Jaws in the Outback, and you can kind of see why. The Razorback in question is this semi-mythical 12-foot warthog that can basically smash through anything and eat anyone. And the movie follows a bunch of characters who are varyingly hunting and or being hunted by this enormous furious pig. One of whom, amusingly, is played by Gregory Harrison, who was Logan in the TV version of Logan's Run. Okay, next up we have Turkey Shoot from 1982. I saw this a long time ago, probably actually not that long after it came out. It would have been about 84, 85. I'm including this because this is kind of, well, it's Ozploitation turned up to 11. It really is. It's one of the most gleefully violent movies I've ever seen. Plot-wise, it's somewhere between the Arnold Schwarzenegger version of The Running Man, which it predates by about 5 years, well, really, and the Hard Target / Most Dangerous Game idea of evil rich people getting to hunt poor people for sport, which recently turned up in that very controversial American movie, The Hunt, about 3 years ago. So while your Mad Max verse kind of perfects the society has fallen, the world plunged into chaos dystopia, this is set very much in the other kind of dystopia, your fascist police state dystopia. In this particular dystopia, political malcontents are rounded up, stuffed into yellow uniforms, and then exiled to this concentration camp on the edge of the jungle. And every now and again, just for shits and giggles, the evil camp commandant, who is actually called Thatcher, that did not go unnoticed upon its initial release, sets inmates loose into the jungle, and he and his rich mates hunt them for sport. Now, you know it's only a matter of time before a bunch of the inmates turn the tables and start hunting the bad guys back, particularly when one of them turns out to be played by Steve Railsback, the great nearly leading man of 80s cinema. This and Life Force on the same resume. Wow. But you know there's going to be some fairly spectacularly inventive carnage in the meantime. And oh boy, is there. The violence in Turkey Shoot is so extreme it kind of tips over from gross into funny. And one can't help but wonder if that was the idea. Okay, next up we have possibly, I don't know if it's the last of the great Ozploitation movies, but certainly the most recent of the great Ozploitation movies, Wolf Creek. Now, this came out in 2005, but I have seen it referred to by, people who apparently know about this kind of thing as an Ozploitation movie. And it's certainly the kind of movie that could only really be made in Australia by Australians, because it very much relies upon that idea of the outback as being an essentially completely lawless environment. The nearest police station is about 800 miles away. And as such, really bad people can get away with doing really bad things because there's just literally no one and nothing there to stop them. And a very bad person does some very bad things in this movie. Now, I know Wolf Creek has spawned at least 1 or 2 sequels and I believe a TV show. I have not tried to watch any of those because I only just made it to the end of Wolf Creek. It's hard going, even more so when you bear in mind that it is extremely loosely based on a couple of real occurrences. And last, possibly the most Ozploitation movie ever made, The Cars That Ate Paris. One of the other interesting features of Ozploitation movies is they occasionally introduce you to people who will then go on to do great things. Mad Max obviously gave the world Mel Gibson and George Miller. The Cars That Ate Paris is directed by Peter Weir. You're watching the movie going, the Witness Master of Commander guy did this? It's another one of those movies that's so grim and freaky that you can't help, you just assume that at least part of it is meant to be comedy. Now, the premise again leans into that idea of rural Australia being this completely unpoliced environment. Because the Paris of the title is, of course, not the one in France, or indeed the one in Texas, but it's one somewhere in rural Australia. And specifically, and this is the most magnificent concept, it's a town in a sort of hollow between several mountains. And these mountains are traversed by means of picturesque but genuinely quite treacherous mountain roads. And the way the town of Paris sustains itself is by booby-trapping these roads so that cars crash, roll down the mountains, and they then scavenge whatever's left when they hit the bottom. Now, one of the things about The Cars That Ate Paris is if you Google image search it, pretty much the only picture that ever comes up is an image of a Volkswagen Beetle covered in spikes to the point that it basically looks like an armored hedgehog. This will give you a misleading impression of this movie. This makes it look like it's a kind of Road Warrior thing 7 years early. And indeed, there is a bit towards the end when the youthful faction of the town take to their souped up evil mobiles and start menacing everybody else. Fairly sure George Miller was watching. But that's just like the last 15-20 minutes of the film. Before that, it's this bizarre black comedy about this town that survives by scavenging the wreckage of car crashes that they're causing, helping themselves to the luggage, recycling the cars, and occasionally recycling the passengers as well. Seriously, you've got to see this film. Okay, there's my 5 favorite Ozploitation movies. You may well beg to differ, in which case differ away in the comments.
Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit like and share. If you'd like to see more, please hit subscribe. And if you'd like to help me make more, please visit patreon.com/MitchBen.
Answer to the trivia question? They both had a best pal called Goose who dies before the end. Should have said spoiler alert.